verse 13, read to verse 21, and some focus on verse 16 of the same. And it came to pass, when I prophesied, that Pelatiah the son of Benaiah died. Then fell I down upon my face, and cried with a loud voice, and said, Ah, Lord God, wilt thou make a full end of the remnant of Israel? Again the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, thy brethren, even thy brethren, the men of thy kindred, and all the house of Israel holy, are they unto whom the inhabitants of Israel have said, Get you far from the Lord, unto us is this land given in possession. Therefore say, Thus saith the Lord God, although I have cast them far off among the heathen, and although I have scattered them among the countries, yet will I be to them as a little sanctuary in the countries where they shall come. Therefore say, Thus saith the Lord God, I will even gather you from the people, and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. And they shall come thither, and they shall take away all the detestable things thereof, and all the abominations thereof from thence. And I will give them one heart, and I will put a new spirit within you, and I will take the stony heart out of their flesh, and will give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes, and keep mine ordinances, and do them. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. But as for them whose heart walketh after the heart of their detestable things and their abominations, I will recompense their way upon their own heads, saith the Lord God. With God's impending judgment coming for Jerusalem through the means of the nation of Babylon, Ezekiel is concerned, even despondent, that there will not be anyone left after the Lord has poured out his fury. There is an irony in his concern, however, because the Lord reveals something of the attitude of those who are yet left in the city. In verse 15, we see that they have virtually excommunicated their brethren and confiscated their lands. God's people in exile are brought low, and now even brought lower. It was bad enough to be overcome by the heathen Babylonians, but now they are even rejected by their own people. However, God assures his prophet and those who might hear that despite their dismal condition, they will not be utterly forsaken. Yet let us see, first of all, that all of this is of the Lord's doing. He says, I have cast them far off among the heathen. This is the context of God's promise, not to hide their sin, nor to pass over it in light of the greater transgression of those in Jerusalem, but rather to reveal it and to show it, that they may see it and turn from it. They are just as deserving to die as those in Jerusalem. As we heard earlier, our hearts, all of our hearts, are sinful and by nature are against our God, and we all have offended in many ways. Here we see, though, that God's promises are shining even brighter and more hopeful, therefore, in light of our failings. For God will not make a full end of his people, yet will I be to them as a little sanctuary in the countries where they shall come. Now here, God's people are like John in Patmos. And there's an interesting parallel between the experience of Ezekiel with that of John. For in the opening of this book, there is an incredible revelation given to the prophet, much like John had in exile as well. The glory and power of the Lord is shown to Ezekiel, an unassailable throne and a larger-than-life king, with angelic beings and the powers of heaven arrayed for him to see. And even if you go on to the end of this chapter, you see something of this too in verses 22 to 25. And so if Ezekiel and others who may have heard of such things were to mind the outward splendor and grandeur of the physical temple, as perhaps in some ways resembled and seen even in his prophetic visions, this promise might actually be rather disappointing. A little sanctuary in the countries where they shall come. No grand, no spectacle of God's glory. No great temple, beauty, and glory. And yet Matthew Henry notes rightly that those at Jerusalem have the temple yet, but without God. Those in Babylon have God, though without the temple. And in many ways, this is always the way it has been for those who have eyes to see it. Many years before, Isaiah had said in chapter 8, verse 13, "Sanctify the Lord of hosts himself, and let him be your fear, and let him be your dread, and he shall be for a sanctuary." The Lord is our tabernacle. The Lord is our temple. God's people in exile were not to build a replacement sanctuary, but God was visiting them at this moment, even in his gracious promise to them, inviting them to consider him and to come into his presence and receive the comfort and hope that only he could give. And that is true of us today. Wherever we go, wherever we are sent, we take God with us, or we should say God goes with us. Even when we are not able to gather physically as we are now. Philip Henry, the father of Matthew Henry, noted from Psalm 118 of the singing of God's people in their own families, in their tents. There we read, "The voice of rejoicing and salvation is in the tabernacles of the righteous." Something of the praise and the glory of God is not lost upon us, though we can't be together, but is heard even in our own homes, and we should not overlook this, nor despise it because it seems a small thing. Like Ezekiel's hearers, wherever God's people are, whatever country they find themselves, even you and I, though we be thousands of kilometers apart, God is with you, and you trust he is with us here. That's the God we serve. He says in verse 20, "They shall be my people, and I will be their God." He is our God. He will never be anything other than our God if we trust in him. We may be presently discouraged, but we need to see God's gracious promise. And I ask you, is that sufficient for you? Can you be content in these things? The Lord speaks of a little sanctuary. Now, commentators differ as to whether little means as size or time or perhaps something else. I think it most likely refers to the time. It makes sense, after all, that in the future, generations would return from Babylon and elsewhere to rebuild the temple of the Lord. And even in this, we see a reminder for us as well that there's just a little time left, just a few more days before the Lord calls us home. There is, however, more yet for us to see. The little sanctuary, the blessing of God with his people, was a foretaste of what was to come. And we also have this foretaste, brethren. It's a foretaste of when the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple, as the book of Revelation tells us. There comes a time where the things that we experience here will be cast off, where the sufferings and troubles of God's people are no longer remembered, where what appears or seems to be the distance of God from us, we will see was no distance at all, but only to make us more and more desirous of that dwelling, eternal dwelling of God and his people in his presence forever. Let us endure now. Let us walk by faith now as we await for the fulfillment of that promise.